The Janki Foundation is a healthcare charity which was started really to support the idea of mind, body and spirit, but particularly the spiritual aspect of healthcare, as there seems to be a vast focus on biomedical model. And although we're aware of how much spiritual things influence us in healthcare, not much is really done to help develop that or sustain that in mainstream healthcare. So these seminars are a way of doing that. Plus the foundation has recently produced and published a facilitator's training manual called Values in Healthcare, A Spiritual Approach. There is lots of literature about the Janki Foundation and about this project downstairs in the main foyer. So at the tea break, please feel free to go and discuss it with anyone or pick up the leaflets or any information. And if you'd like to be on our mailing list, just fill out a form and we can keep in contact with you. So, sorry, I forgot to tell you who I am. I'm Sarah Eager. I'm a medical advisor for the Janki Foundation. And without any further ado, as we are running a bit behind, I'd like to introduce Dr. Andrew Powell, who will be our chair for the main session. Andrew is a psychiatrist and a psychotherapist. He was the founder chair of this special interest group in spirituality at the Royal College of Psychiatrists and has had a long-standing interest in spiritual aspects of medicine and psychiatry. So I'd like to invite Andrew up onto the stage. Andrew is going to caretake the main event of the day. I'll be popping up just to help host and guide proceedings, but Andrew will be taking care of the content of the day, so I'll hand over to you. Thank you, Andrew.
I just want to make a very brief preamble. As Sarah was saying, medicine these days is highly mechanistic. That's fine if you've broken your hip and you need a hip replacement. It's very good for you if you've got a heart valve fall apart, as I did some years ago, and have an artificial one. So everything that we're going to discuss this afternoon, I think, can be discussed respectfully, respectful of some of the marvelous achievements of medicine. On the other hand, the emphasis on the mechanical view that the body is just a collection of molecules and chemistry leaves out, of course, the essence of the person. It's disease-centered rather than person-centered medicine. And if you think about the language that we use, the war on cancer, the magic bullet, fighting for life, it's very militaristic, it's very aggressive. And I have to add here that I have heard Dadi use a military metaphor, one of bombs, but the bombs she refers to are bombs of love. And I hope later on we'll hear more from Dadi about that. Now, with this backdrop, our deep questioning of the mechanistic view of medicine, it's a great pleasure to introduce Kim Jobst to you. I first met Dr. Jobst when I was working in Oxford at the Warneford Hospital, I think about 1987, and he was on the psychiatric rotation then. And as soon as I saw him, I realized he was an unusual man. He was not the kind of routine trainee. He carried himself with some quality of presence and individuality, which I then learned later is revealing of his very wide interests. He'd been in medicine before coming to psychiatry. He'd already published a very controversial paper on the benefits of acupuncture in breathlessness. He was in a Jungian analysis. He was already medical director of the Optima project in Oxford, which is a very high-level research project looking at the whole physical and biochemical basis of Alzheimer's disease. And Kim and his team were among the first to explore that illness from the point of view of neuroscience, imaging, brain imaging. And then, not content with that, Kim was also becoming deeply interested in homeopathy. He went up to Glasgow, where he worked as a physician and a homeopathist for a number of years. During that time, he was also editor-in-chief, and still is, of the Journal of Alternative and Complementary Medicine. And I know that Kim has brought a number of copies of that journal that I think are outside in the foyer, and people might like to look at that. I think they're complimentary copies. That's very generous of him. At the moment, Kim is back south with us. He's a visiting professor at Brookes University, Oxford, and he's an honorary consultant physician at the Royal Homeopathic Hospital, London. And Kim, it's a great pleasure to welcome you here, to ask you to join us, and to hear your presentation. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation to be here. We stand and sit at an extraordinary time. The recent events have, in my view, focused the minds of all those who have access to the media on the subject of this afternoon's exploration in a way that perhaps very few things ever could have done. The natural disaster has, I think, forced many people to search for meaning, and to search for meaning in ways that they might not otherwise have had to do. My own experience has been that there is meaning, extraordinary meaning to be found. And the wisdom within what has been happening and what we have seen is paradoxically, as you will see through our exploration this afternoon, a means towards profound healing. Healing at a personal level, cultural level, and planetary and beyond. And unless we can embrace what is a very painful process at times, which leads to a completely new way of seeing, of experiencing, and of being, the healing that we require at a personal and planetary level will evade us. It's that which I'd like to explore today. It's rendered us a little more poignant for me personally, as I hadn't realized coming here today that just next door in the cemetery lie my grandparents. And it's really rather heartening, because of course this whole thing is about life and death. I begin with a quote that came to me as a medical student in Oxford. A mind that is stretched by a new idea can never go back to its original dimensions. I have absolutely no doubt that all of us today are going to meet some new ideas. I hope much more than simply ideas. But as ideas, they are seeds that can lead to transformation. The next two images are extremely important. This is a crystal of water formed through a rather sophisticated process developed by a Japanese man called Emoto, from water that has been placed over a piece of paper with the words love and thanks written on it. This is a crystal of water, the same water, that had been placed over a piece of paper with the words hate and evil written on it. The same substance, identical substance, but two different forms. The tsunami disaster and my own work have led me in a new way to explore these words, as you sow, so shall you reap. And the quote at the bottom is really a humorous way of saying that aphorism applies no matter who you are, where you come from, what walk of life, who you believe in, what you profess. It is a fact. It is a lawful, spiritual, and scientific fact. And it is within that context that we need to look at what has been happening around us. My own work has developed more recently as a result of realizing that as I grew up in medicine and medical science, I had been led to see disease and health as two distinctly separate and opposite things. What emerged for me as a medical student and in my, at that time, absolute secret training as an acupuncturist was the realization that in fact they are part and parcel of one and the same thing. They're part of life. They are healthy parts of normal functioning. It's quite a challenging concept, and I'd like to explore it more with you. But before doing that, perhaps we could enter it with a fable. And it's the butterfly's lesson, which runs something like this. One day, a small opening appeared on a chrysalis that was hanging on the branch of a tree. A child sat and watched for the butterfly to come out. For several hours he sat as it struggled to force its body through the tiny little hole. And it seemed to the child that it stopped making any progress, as if it had got stuck. It seemed to the child that it had managed as much as it could, and that it could go no further. So the child decided to help the butterfly. And he took a tiny pair of scissors and opened the cocoon. The butterfly emerged easily. It had a withered little body, it was tiny, and its wings were still shriveled. And the child continued to watch because she expected that at any moment the wings would open, enlarge, and expand to be able to support the butterfly's body and become firm and fly into the sky. But neither happened. In fact, the butterfly spent the rest of its life crawling around with a withered body and shriveled wings. It never was able to fly. What the child, in her kindness and goodwill, did not understand was that the restricting chrysalis and the struggle required for the butterfly to get through that tiny hole were life's way of massaging fluid from the body of the butterfly into its wings, so that it would be ready for flight once it emerged from the cocoon. Sometimes struggles are exactly what we need in our life. For if God allowed us to go through life without any obstacles, it would actually cripple us. We would not be as strong as we could be. In other words, we might never be able to fly. Now, with that story as a backdrop, let us stop also to ponder an extraordinary fact. Why is it that in the most advanced, affluent, educated, and liberal era of history, so many people are so ill with currently largely incurable diseases? Diabetes, irritable bowel syndrome, arthritis, period problems, skin diseases, ME and chronic fatigue, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, migraine, cancer, allergies, sensitivities, obesity, depression, back pain, and so it continues. More so than ever before. Why? We will address that question as we proceed. Before we do so, let's return to the quote on the program from Dadi Janki, which I love in the simplicity of its expression. Being sick is an opportunity to express yourself in a new way. Do you understand and accept this opportunity readily? Or are you unable to take advantage of it? Too distracted by the illness? If that is the case, then you need to take a closer look at yourself to see where another kind of sickness might lie. Think about that in relation to this question. Why more people than ever before are so ill with currently incurable diseases? My proposition, and in the context of the new idea, is that health and the current phenomena in medicine and the profusion of therapies may be, to our age, the revolutionary force that reading was to the Renaissance. For it is about an evolution, a revolution in seeing, experiencing, and communicating. It is about the energy of being. It is about the wisdom within disease. So what is wisdom? Well, this is my attempt in the early hours of this morning as I've struggled to put these ideas together for today. And wisdom is about sensing, working with, and aligning oneself and others to life, to meaning and an appreciation of the intrinsic wholeness and interconnectedness of life, of being able to act in such a way as to support the harmonious development of man and nature. The current phenomenon we live in manifest in our cultural obsession with medicine and therapies. Look at any magazine, anywhere. It's profusion of information about alternative therapies, alternative that, complementary this. Creatively expressed, it is in the practice of integrated medicine that is gradually emerging, championed by the sort of work that the Foundation is doing here, represents the potential for an evolution in science and healing. An evolution which neither separates nor antagonizes, a science which seeks to understand wholeness and health, a science which seeks to integrate. That is its role. That is the role of this profusion of largely so-called incurable diseases, and they aren't incurable. That's the beauty of it. It means that this whole time is about a deeper meaning than simply a reaction against science and biomolecular medicine, a deeper understanding of ourselves and our lives, a search for causes beyond the biomolecular. It is about wisdom. It is perhaps a wake-up call to physicians and scientists, to all of us, to retrieve or to discover something which perhaps has been neglected in our recent scientific odyssey, and it has been an extraordinary odyssey. It is not simply about knowledge, herbal, technical, molecular, or otherwise. It is about something perhaps as simple as attention, as bedside manner, vocation, and time. The realization of there being wisdom within disease, whatever that disease may be, of disease as a manifestation of health, as a healthy response to the situation, and with meaning, reflects what I have coined as a term, functional shift. A functional shift in perception. If disease can be seen as a manifestation of health rather than an alien entity afflicting or destroying the individual or community, then its meaning is neither arbitrary nor random, and that is important. So many of our patients, so many of us, when we become diseased or ill, see this as something that has happened to us. The proposition, of course, is that it's something quite different. Such a functional shift in perception draws attention to our restricted understanding of disequilibrium, whether that be physical, perceptual, and importantly, whether that be spiritual. Disease can be seen to be the healthy expression, dis-ease, of a restricted sense of meaning or understanding or ability to cope in life, often with its roots in a person's distant past or that of their family, their genetic heritage. And this is important because this view takes one, the deeper one goes into it, beyond this instantaneous time frame. That being the case, the process then must be, should be facilitated because it is integral to the dynamic equilibrium that we call health. What I'm saying is that illness provides an opportunity for us to grow. For in a sense, if you take these ideas to their logical conclusion, we have given ourselves illness. It's not that anybody else gave it to us. We give it to ourselves. It's a gift, this dis-ease. In order to take care of more frightening psychological or spiritual needs or concerns which we do not yet have the consciousness to deal with differently. Therein lies its wisdom. The language being the symptoms, the metaphors, in the mind and body that come before us. Disease and learning, therefore, are a part of life. And paradoxically, these diseases of meaning are healthy responses. They are symptoms, alerting mechanisms to the restrictions and the consequences of more primitive understanding or meaning, and the need for their transformation. In other words, or as an example, just think about how hunger drives someone to search for food. It's very primitive. Extrapolate into the symptoms or experiences of an illness or disease and how that drives one to understand in a different way. And gradually, therefore, the vertical dimension begins to open up within us. In other words, they are the only way that the organism can manifest in that moment, given its existing level of understanding and consciousness, and given its existing metaphors and experience. If all we have is the metaphor of war, of battle, of fight, how else do we begin to experience another dimension, except that it is not working for us? And that's why it is such a healthy response. That's why this idea offers insights for the prevention and treatment of all diseases. Whether I fall off this stage and break my ankle, or I find that I've got cancer or Alzheimer's disease, the same applies. Critical to it and to the negative spiral causing diseases of meaning is the perception that the disease, the origins of which may be social, industrial, ecological, as well as medical or physiological, is unavoidable and can only be remedied by being cut out, excised, eradicated, pharmacologically blocked or genetically modified. Such a sad view. But if we can change that perception, if we can transform it, a totally different healing scenario emerges. And there's evidence for this, with far-reaching consequences for education, for practice, for policy, whether in healthcare, and what is really important is this goes way beyond healthcare, into industry, to politics and ecology. I believe it's what this organization is all about. The miracle is, and it is a miracle, that when seen like this, when wisdom within disease is seen for what it is, the level of consciousness changes. Such a perceptual shift, this functional shift, on its own, may sometimes cure the problem. But how? The how is miraculously beautiful. Such a functional shift, a change in consciousness, promotes radical changes to behavior and physiology. And as such, it changes the human being. It's a very simple example. Depression. I suspect that every single person in this room has been depressed at one time or another. And it does not you will know that it does not merely reflect disease in a negative sense. It is the healthy physiological and psycho-spiritual response, often to unconsciously held, destructive and disempowering meanings from which there appears to be no escape. Appears to be. Probably everybody in this room, too, has experienced how a change in perception of meaning can totally transform the landscape, the whole human being. However, just as an enzyme is not changed in a chemical reaction, neither are the circumstances which caused the disease of meaning, the depression. But with the functional shift, the meaning, the response of the whole organism and the symptoms of the disease may alter profoundly, so that what was once destructive becomes a source of life, of growth and vigor. Just think about it. You're depressed. You understand something completely differently. Nothing has changed, apparently, in the external world, but everything has changed because you are different in relation to it. Perceived meaning and the way it affects how life is lived, therefore, my contention, is at the root of all disease. Inevitably, all interventions, whether through changes in perception, of meaning, whether pharmacological or even surgical, are ultimately manifest in molecular and chemical changes. Realize this: there is no thought, feeling, or perception without accompanying molecular and chemical reaction and change. In other words, there is no thought or feeling, no experience without a physical manifestation at some level. This is the wisdom within disease and of diseases of meaning. It recognizes not only psychophysical but also spiritual etiologies in the causation of disease, which, just like bacteria, microorganisms, can be transmitted. I love this because it's so practical at so many different levels. It is not only transmissible as an infectious agent because of ideas that we share through dissemination. It is also because when one lives this, one's whole biochemistry changes, and therefore the entire electromagnetic field, the entire aura. Which of you noticed, as Dadi Janki walked into the room today, how the entire feel of the room changed? Like that. It is infectious. That there is wisdom within disease is a radical transformation of metaphor. I think we can all agree on that, which can be the core component in turning the destructive aspects of diseases of meaning into inspirational and creative health. While the current biomolecular paradigm is limited to incremental change, steps, if any change at all, the paradigm we're exploring of wisdom within disease draws us to experiencing the importance of and the role of meaning in our lives and in our experiences of illness. And as such, it is an opportunity for quantal change. It is a total transformation. So I come back to my original assertion. Health and the understanding of wisdom within disease. And it takes courage to go there. Just stop a moment, all of you women who may or may not have had children. I've been privileged to be the witness of all 4 births of my own children. There is a moment before the birth, and it happened before every birth, and all those whose births I've also assisted, where there's a transition point. There's no going back, and the mother knows that she will be confronted with an extraordinary experience. The end result always justifies what has gone through. And it is the same as we enter into this whole concept of disease, we enter into our pain, as we enter into our suffering. It is that process which may be, to our age, the revolutionary force that reading was to the Renaissance, for it is about an evolution in seeing, experiencing, and communicating. It is about the energy of being. It is about relating differently to ourselves and to our lives as a whole. It is about the reconnection of spirit to our physical lives. But for this to be possible, there must be dialogue. And there must be dialogue that is capable of creating meaning, which recognizes that at his or her current level of evolution, dis-ease is vital to the human being. And that paradoxically, the pandemic of diseases of meaning which are upon us is a wake-up call to the wisdom within disease. As such, they are the great opportunity to enable understanding how we might better prepare for the future by being in the present. In fact, therefore, what we find is that no matter what happens, we have everything we need, and that what is happening, whether inwardly or outwardly, is the manifestation at that moment of the level of consciousness of the being in question. Thank you.
But that was a lovely presentation, and that image of the butterfly, it goes so deep, doesn't it? Because, oh, how lovely. Isn't that beautiful? Yes. Because I was thinking how the wisdom is in the caterpillar, that it's going to somehow know what it is to become, to express itself fully. Or you could say the bud that becomes the rose. Now, I really want to just begin by asking you a bit more about how you think the body is communicating, so that we can understand a bit more about this language, because our response so often to symptoms of ill health is to get frightened. And I suppose most of us are frightened because we're afraid of dying. Is that coming from my microphone or somebody else? Let's take this out. Could be me. Okay. So we get frightened. Now, that the Taoist view of healthcare, which goes back 2,500 years, is very much, so we're in the same area as you're thinking, but somehow one has to make sense of the symptoms. So are there always, is there always an opportunity for meaning? Have you ever come across a time when there wasn't?
No, I have never come across any situation where there isn't an opportunity to access a different level.
How about when someone has advanced dementia?
Well, I actually found working with demented patients extremely challenging and very, very rewarding, ultimately. To understand, what one needs to try to do is to understand what is manifest in front of one. And in advanced dementia, as many of you will know and have experienced, it is the simplistic way of describing it is that short-term memory and then ultimately long-term memory are eradicated. The way that patients, the way that relatives refer to it is that the gradual erosion of the person that they knew takes place before their eyes. What it did for me, and it was very much part of my journey, was to ask the question, why should somebody want or need to forget? If I'm working from the premise that I give myself disease as part of my growth and development, what is it that I'm seeking to forget? I have never yet found in any single case a situation where there has not been some form of trauma. And you might well then argue that everybody's got trauma, everybody's got skeletons in the cupboard, so why don't we all get X, Y, or Z? The fact is that we all get something, and it depends entirely on our relationship and reaction to that something. Now, what to me may be a relatively insignificant stress in life may be to somebody else something very, very significant. And in something like Alzheimer's disease, if that significant something is something one is then trying to suppress, an enormous amount of energy has to go on subconsciously to stop those thoughts, those memories coming to the surface all the time. And that process erodes, kills cells. I have a wonderful case example that I can give you of a lady of 86 whom I went to see, who was apparently quite advanced in her dementing process. And in the course of our first meeting, she obviously felt that she could trust me, and she was a gloriously beautiful old lady. And she told me about an extremely traumatic event that had happened very early on in her married life. And the consequence of which was that she had never been able to consummate her marriage after 60 years, and nobody knew that their 2 children had been adopted. And this all came out quite lucidly. So we actually did something about that and enabled her and her husband, who was still alive, to consummate their marriage at that stage in their lives. And her level of dementia, I mean, she returned to normal functioning. We have all the records are there. And for me, that was an extraordinary example And what was also extraordinary over the 2 or 3 years that we were able to scan her was that there were objective changes on the brain scans that could monitor this. What is very interesting was that when her husband died and she was put into care, she deteriorated extremely rapidly.
And how often we see with cancer and other terminal illnesses, the person suddenly decline when there is no sense of purpose, no sense of being, and the environment is suddenly changed, and they lose their sense of self accordingly. In science, there are two broad groups, those who think top-down and those who think bottom-up. The bottom-up people say we are nothing but our genes. Consciousness is a sort of byproduct of evolution. The top-down people say there's something there is a force, an energy, a consciousness that actually gives birth to our physical form. Which way round would you see it, or both?
Oh, I mean, I think everybody would know. They could, if you ask the audience the question, I'm a top-down person. Where was I before I was born? I don't have an obvious or simple answer to that question, but it used to exercise me a great deal as a child. And but the fact is that something was there before the physical was made manifest. And the miracle is quite clearly that the immaterial, so-called immaterial, is inherent in the material. And without the immaterial would have no life. Nowhere is that more graphically illustrated for me than in the anatomy dissecting room or at the bedside of someone who is dying. There comes a moment when the body is there and the life has gone, but everything is still in place. All the chemicals, all the cells, everything is still it's there, but it's dead. What is it that is left?
And the eyes change.
Yeah.
And I don't know how you measure that, or even if you want to measure it, but those of us who've been in that situation see it, don't
Absolutely.
You? Yes. So if I push you a bit further, you mentioned earlier that it's different things for different people. One person may get one kind of disease, inverted commas, somebody else another. Why should that be? Is it predetermined? Is it something to do with our psyches? Is it just our genetic predisposition?
I am both and am not God, so I can't answer that for everybody. We get what we get because it's what we need in that moment, which is a very difficult thing to say to somebody who has a child that has a genetic disease, or a Down syndrome baby, or born with a serious congenital malformation, or somebody who's just faced a diagnosis of cancer or dementia. But that's all an intellectual abstraction at one level. At the practical level, the disease itself, the process that is going on, is a gateway to a different kind of understanding. And it's very interesting. It's not easy to talk about, but in my own experience, as I have sought to accompany and to understand patients in their own process and people in their process, I have found myself inevitably being drawn into perception of life that is beyond this life. So the genetic disease, for example, which I am now much more of the view is not necessarily irremediable, is the carriage of generations of a problem. And the beauty is that in any one generation it is possible to do such an enormous amount to help heal previous generations and, of course, generations for the future.
So that means that you're conceptualizing something beyond our usual understanding of space and time.
Yes, although I think I take great delight in reading and exchanging with physicists and scientists for whom this current space-time is others at the same time.
There was a study recently by Libovici on the retroactive effects of prayer, suggested that if you, I think they prayed for a group that were from a cohort some years before and found, without knowing, it was a double-blind control trial, that the group that was prayed for did better than the other group, although we're going back in time a number of years. I mean, can you talk that kind of language with your scientist colleagues?
Well, with some. I mean, obviously, if I go into the palace of SmithKline Beecham or GlaxoSmithKline as they now are, it might be a bit difficult. Although it's actually very interesting how many people are struggling with these perceptions and realizations in the context of their lives, and are therefore profoundly in conflict, which takes me straight into the wisdom of disease, because these are the very people who are getting ill. You know, it's their vehicle out, it's their way into another dimension.
But you told me something rather chilling at lunchtime, that one of the findings from the Optima project on dementia had been that folic acid might be very good for you if you're suffering from dementia. And you took that back to which company?
Bristol Myers Squibb.
Squibb was sponsoring some of your research. And they said, oh, so what? Meaning there's no money in it.
Well, we are, in my view, we're living at a time of radical transformation in the pharmaceutical industry, if we want to put a positive light on it. The paradigm, the framework within which we have explored the biochemical is needing to change, it's needing to grow. The discoveries that we made were that not so much that it was a treatment for dementia when you got it seriously, but much more that nutritional approaches could help to prevent that. And in the 10 years since we made that discovery, of course, there's been a lot more evidence. Everything that we are talking about today is about a different worldview. And if the focus of one's attention is to make money and to make money alone, then the kind of work and the kind of that we are doing now is relatively meaningless, unless all you want to do is commercialize in a rather cheap way the process of transformation, which many are doing. It is also possible that that work can lead us then into another dimension, and what the challenge that is before us is not to have a holier-than-thou approach, but to embrace each person where they are, the level at which they're working. And my own my hope and my view now is that we will see that transformation, but we will not see it without a period of quite intense suffering.
You put the word integrative up. So I guess that's enormously important if we're not to simply generate more splits, because the human ego is such that it's very easy to get into your own corner and then find 1,000 good reasons why you should stay there. And the end point of that is that you stop talking with anybody else. Right. So how can you work as a physician with someone perhaps with an established physical illness? It might be a respiratory disease or renal disease or something. And there is a pathology in the usual meaning of the word. The tissues are damaged. And yet you want to open the dialogue to the idea that that renal disease, kidney disease might have a meaning, a communication. Now, for a lot of people, that's a big step to take, isn't it?
It is always a big step to take. The heartening thing as a physician, and I'm sure that the physicians and psychiatrists that are here today would agree with me, is that actually, when you open to that, you find that the majority of patients are coming to you because that's what they really want to know. That's what they're really asking about. It's because, after all, it is their life. I find one needs to be careful, because opening that dimension, and which is ultimately a dimension of personal responsibility for what is happening, can be quite frightening. And so one needs to be led by the patient at their own pace.
And it can lead to the idea, this is my fault.
That's right.
But that it's a guilt laden experience.
Which is immensely destructive. Immensely destructive. And it is as destructive as the view that if you die with disease, you're somehow imperfect. You're somehow an imperfect human being. I happened to be at a presentation in India some years ago, someone who was regarded as a spiritual teacher, who actually said in front of over 1,000 people that any person who is physically or mentally disabled is actually an imperfect human being. And I was very, very surprised, very shaken by that view. The fact is that, and the presentation that I make, where I sit in all of this, is that everything is perfect as it is. It is our vehicle. It is our vehicle towards a greater understanding, a greater participation in life. What is extraordinary and remarkable about working with people, for example, cancer cases, who they're going to die. There's no, that is the stage that they are at in their lives, but that who want to explore this dimension, who are being brought, that after all their bodies are taking them into it, is that the passage is so transformed. So that death is something completely different for them as a result of that. Now that is life-giving. I haven't been there yet, so I don't know, but I look on and I participate with awe as people go through that. It's an immense privilege.
For many people, it seems to require a really serious illness for them to be able to stop and actually experience the now, which is the essence of life.
Absolutely, which brings us right back to the beginning of the current crisis.
You mentioned the tsunami at the beginning of your talk. There are a lot of people there who are desperately bereaved and whose lives have been shattered. Any reflections on that as a physician?
Many reflections, but how to articulate them is a huge challenge. I don't think there is any simple or easy answer to these kinds of situations, and part of the challenge is actually to embrace the enormity of the situation. From the very simple and obvious human suffering to the loss of an infrastructure, the realization that this has eradicated whole ways of living, to then the grotesque imagery of children being taken for sex, because it's easy within that situation, to the exploitation and the using of aid as a power tool, and realizing therefore just how difficult the task is for the human psyche as it is now, and then taking that into the context of environment change and the theories that some are saying now that because of the melting of the ice cap, there has been a loss of pressure in the Antarctic, which has meant that the plates are shifting more than they would have done. So one then realized, one is taken into, in a sense, a meditation that places the individual human suffering in a global context. It is not something that can be talked about easily. But I'm also sure that if the person in the midst of their suffering can be with those who are also managing to hold that space, then that suffering is also their gateway to another dimension.
And it's the opportunity for the awakening of compassion in
As there
others
have
who
been, absolutely.
didn't suffer the loss themselves. Yes.
Absolutely.
It sounds to me as if, by implication, what you're saying is that when you're with someone who could move forward and begin to try to explore what the disease means, what the communication is, that the main thing is to facilitate that inquiry without feeling you have to have an answer. I mean, we have a large body of psychological theory ever since Sigmund Freud. You've had a Jungian analysis yourself. So these are great discoveries about the mind that have been mapped out. And yet the danger is that, of course, you instantly begin to map what you think someone is experiencing, rather than finding a way to let them discover what they're experiencing. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, what you say is absolutely true. The challenge for any therapist working with somebody in this way is to get out the way. And yet, at the same time, not to be afraid of making a suggestion or facilitating the confrontation.
And to be there without feeling that they must have an answer.
And without judgment. Absolutely. An answer, the answer can and very often is in the experience.
And if the experience is one of love,
well, then you're home and dry.
Okay. We've time for some questions from the audience. Would you like to put up your hand if you've got a question for Dr. Jobst? There's a roving microphone which is going to come to you from the side. There.
Thank you very much. My name's Nick Good. I'm from Cambridge. And the first thing I'd like to say is thank you so much, Kim and Dadi. This is such a wonderful experience and so enriching and like liberation to hear these words coming from somebody from the medical profession. What I want to say is about 7 years ago I saw my father and my younger brother die of cancer. At the same time I was diagnosed with cancer. So I kind of understand a lot about what you're saying already. What I really wanted to do is really anchor it if I can, because the information is so wonderful, and it's just what we're doing here in this spiritual organization, this fusion of spirituality and physiology, and experiencing the joy of this incredible transformation. But what I see, not only in this university but in the world at large, is how this is sabotaged. This amazing process is sabotaged through fundamental ignorance of biological processes, and how we eat and drink in an inappropriate manner if your biology, if your digestive system is already weakened, and you break certain very basic fundamental rules that I discovered and applied to my healing, such as food combining principles, alkalinizing, and hydrating the system. If you don't do that, then the possibility of this transformation into this butterfly of such joy and bliss becomes an unnecessarily painful experience. And I just want to make sure that point was really in there, because the things that you've been discussing are wonderful, but if it's not anchored in that basic understanding of how to eat, what to eat, when to eat and drink, then you're sort of making it unnecessarily difficult.
Thank you for that. It's absolutely right, and it is part of the thesis. The diseases the list, which could have been twice as long, as you know, are largely there because of the how. And it's an important thing to remember, is that whilst that is absolutely right, it is also a fact that if one is spiritually aligned, there's a great deal of toxicity that can be accommodated within the human organism and dealt with in a way that would otherwise have killed people. Most of us aren't there. and therefore what you say is so important. And that's the reason for the whole thesis, is one has to start. You've got to start with the basic fundamental building blocks. And these diseases, why they are so full of meaning, is that when you start to look at what is needed to put it right, it says, well, you've got to look at your whole life. What are you putting in here? So, thank you. It's absolutely right.
Another question or comment?
Ray Bhatt, Janki Foundation. Andrew and Kim, you have really opened the treasure chest for all of us this afternoon. Maybe something in the distant past occurred on a similar level. I'm going back in time to 1886, when there was a magic triangle set up in Paris. I think you probably already guessed. There was a meeting where Thomas Addison of Guise, Pasteur, and Claude Bernard came to a common meeting. And that's where Pasteur discovered the first bacteria. And Claude Bernard was speaking about the constancy of milieu interior. And this was grossly misinterpreted by science as being only that of the molecular level. And of course, our Thomas was the champion of modern medicine, the coronary heart disease and gallbladder and steroids and the adrenal and the cycles and what have you. The reason why this is so important is it happened at the time of the first tsunami. Krakatau produced the most horrible first tsunami. And you have shown crystals that have got perfection on the one hand and anger on the other hand. These tsunami waves that came, do you think they were molecules that had become angry and formed the waters because of the current external milieu having become so evil?
Well, I didn't know about that meeting in 1886. I'm absolutely fascinated that those three got together. That is so significant because it was at the same time that acupuncture first came into France and was first used for anesthesia and got eradicated because of the development of the anesthetic gases. And it found its way into Osler's first textbook of medicine at that time, 1886. Very, very interesting. I don't know that I'm in any position to comment on the anger or otherwise of the molecules of water in the tsunami wave. What I would also say is that I just want to shift the context of your description of the ice crystals, because they are both perfect. And that's really important. They both manifest consequence. So you can be and hold on to your anger and hatred if you wish, but being over 70% water, look what's happening to it. Right? If you crystallize it out, that's what it looks like, but it also has that vibration, that frequency in the non-crystalline state. So that has an electromagnetic consequence, which will then affect everybody else around you. You can work towards being able to be a receptacle for and container for a harmonious and loving frequency, not easy all the time, confess, and then look at what order is there. So they are both perfect, and they are both perfect manifestations of certain frequencies. I don't have any doubt personally that the tsunami that we witnessed in that way is a manifestation of the totality of now. It is there to serve a purpose, given that we reap what we sow, and we are part of the whole. Now, it may have been that had we been able to do certain things better, it wouldn't have been necessary, or change the language, it might not have happened. You don't have to use necessary. I don't know the answer to that. And now I'm speaking entirely personally. My own view is that we need not have gone through a whole lot of the war and violence of the last few years. And had we chosen not to, and we had the opportunity not to, things would be very different. It's obvious at one level, but I don't mean it at a facile level at all. And that having made the decision to do what we did, and we are all complicit, that's the other thing that is very difficult to take on board. George Bush is part of me. Not easy, that. So unless I can accommodate him, I'm nowhere and I'm nothing. I'm no better or no worse. But so having done that, life, the big thing, says, right, okay, guys, I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to hit you pretty hard to bring you back. And I am convinced that we can be brought back.
Well, we have to close this part of the afternoon now. We do end on this extraordinarily important and deep question of that the power of thought, and that every action begins with a thought. And I know that that's going to be a theme we'll take on in the second half of the afternoon. Thank you so much, Kim, for a wonderful presentation, such a penetrating and searching presentation about such an important matter. Thank you very much.